Riches are measured in money, but wealth is measured in time. And far more important than the size of the sum is actually creating the habit. If, until now, you've been eating your meals from one big pot, so to speak, then what you'll start doing now is taking from that big pot and portioning it out onto, say, 6 different plates. And then you can only eat what's been designated for that plate. What is the biggest problem Estonians have with money? In the summer of 2023, the Ministry of Finance published a survey on financial literacy in Estonia. It revealed that about half of all Estonians have cash reserves for less than 3 months. This means that if something were to happen to their income, they could only manage for up to 3 months. In other words, they're at a survival level. And the reason for this is that they've never consciously built up a financial buffer for themselves. That is, they haven't paid themselves first. I remember very well when I was working a regular salaried job, I didn't have the habit of putting money aside. Since I had a good enough income, I could afford my expenses and there was always a little left over, so I didn't have to worry too much about it. But at one point, I realized that the more my income grew, my expenses grew right along with it. And regardless of whether my income was, I don't know, 2,000 euros a month or 3,000 euros a month, the amount I had left at the end of the month was always exactly the same. And it was only years later when I became, let's say, money smarter, that I understood that regardless of the size of your income, you need to build the habit of paying yourself first every month and putting that money aside. First, because unexpected things happen in life. One thing's for sure, everything changes, and we can't predict the situations where we might actually need those cash reserves. Second, when we start building a cash reserve, we also need to set money aside for investing. And if we don't have that financial buffer, we'll never start investing either. For many people, one of the main obstacles to getting started is that they say, I don't have the money to start with today. But the fact that you don't have that money today actually stems from not having the habit of putting it aside in the first place. So that's definitely a topic you could think about. Now, as you're watching this video, you could take a moment to calculate how large your cash reserve is today. Is it 1 month? Is it 2 months? Is it 3 months? And if you were to lose all of your income today, how many months could you actually manage? In that regard, there's let's say, a definition or concept that I really liked about how to distinguish between being rich and being wealthy. Riches are measured in money, but wealth is measured in time. And time is definitely a more important resource in our lives than money is. And you can measure your wealth like this. Let's take a simple example. Let's say your expenses are 1,000 euros a month and you have 3,000 euros set aside. This means that if your income were to disappear, your wealth today is 3 months. And now the question is, how can you start consciously increasing your wealth? So building cash reserves and paying yourself first is definitely a topic you should consciously address. And many people who are at that survival level justify not doing this by saying that their income is too low today. My experience has been that building cash reserves doesn't actually depend on the size of your income. Even if your income is small, you can still create the habit of putting aside, for example, even just 1% of that income. And creating that habit is actually far more important than the size of the sum. And I remember when I made the decision to leave my salaried job, I didn't actually have a cash reserve built up at that point that would have allowed me to live for a longer period, so to speak, without a salary. And in order to take that step, so to speak, I had to make a one-time transaction. Namely, I sold my apartment, which was my former residence that I had been renting out. And I did this in 2009 during the financial crisis when real estate prices had just plummeted. But since I had made the decision to quit my salaried job, selling that apartment gave me the opportunity to buy 12 months of time. Now, if I had been smarter, I could have built up that financial buffer over many years so that I would have already had that 12-month cash reserve. But luckily, I had an extra move up my sleeve, so to speak, which still allowed me to get out of that situation. So the fact is that unexpected situations happen in life, and we definitely need to create a cash reserve for ourselves. My recommendation is that it should be at least 6 months. And if you currently have 1 or 2 months worth, you can actually start acting more consciously from your very next payday, create that money habit, and begin putting money aside for yourself. How can you do that? You can do it by first paying yourself first. That is, you decide what you want to put money aside for in the first place. We actually have a longer online course about this, where the whole thing is explained in simple terms. But in short, you need to create 6 different accounts where you can put money aside for living expenses, entertainment, self-development, investing, charity, and also for long-term savings. Because these are the accounts you'll generally need in life, and it's better to think about them in advance rather than trying to act in hindsight, so to speak. And now, when your income arrives, before you make a single expense, you divide it, so to speak, among those 6 different accounts. So, to put it figuratively, if until now you've been eating, so to speak, from one big pot, what you'll start doing now is taking from that big pot and putting it onto 6 different plates. And you can only eat, so to speak, as much as is on that plate. And now if you haven't created that cash reserve for yourself, you can't eat from that plate at that moment. So this is actually possible for everyone. You can basically start doing this from your very next payday. I've spoken with people who say that their income is only 1,000 euros a month, that it's impossible for them to put money aside. So if you were to put, let's say, 1% into 5 of the accounts and leave 95% for living expenses, you would actually manage on 950 euros a month instead of the previous 1,000. And what's interesting, which behavioral science has also studied, is that when we have fewer cash reserves, we actually become more innovative, we become more resourceful, and we actually find a way to manage with a slightly smaller income, so to speak. So you don't have to take a big step right away, you can take a small step. That is, the first step is to create this system for yourself in the first place. I would perhaps recommend putting that same 1% into those other accounts, so to speak, and leaving the 95% for your living expenses, and starting to move forward from there. What you can do is, every quarter, start increasing that percentage, so to speak. And maybe next quarter, if the numbers, so to speak, are working out, you raise it to 2% and leave 90% for living expenses. So in this way, you can start moving forward in small steps. And what this does is that actually within a fairly short period of time, you'll see that first, you can cover your expenses, and second, you've created a financial buffer for those, so to speak, necessary things.